All right, here we go. Absolutely honored. On my fourth episode of Get It Right, we have J. Russell Peltz with us, the author of, and I actually have it with me because I'm going to be quoting it throughout this, $30 and a Cut Eye. So as we were just saying, you're the first person I've actually had a chance to ask questions about a book that's been written that I've read. Really an interesting, cool dynamic. I think I'm going to ask the first question. I believe it might have been in the book, but I don't recall. Why not just Russell Peltz? Why the J at the beginning?
Um, my father was a practical joker, and he wanted me to be like J. Pierpont Morgan, the wealthy financier at the start of the last century. So he put it in front of my name. There, it doesn't stand for anything. The letter J is the name. That's why there's no period after it. And I tell this bit of history trivia. Do you have any idea what Harry S. Truman, the S stood for in Harry S. Truman?
I'm now guessing it didn't stand for anything.
They didn't know what to make his middle name. He had two grandfathers, Ship and Solomon, so they just made the S. Now, they put a period after it, but it really shouldn't be there.
That is funny. Okay, perfect. So you start off, obviously, it's all been covered in the book, so I'm going to try to ask questions that weren't answered there. It'll be a challenge, but I'm going to do the best I can. You had an amateur boxing career before becoming a journalist, and from what I recall, you fell in love with the fights the same way everyone else typically does, watching them on TV. What was it? Because you covered all sports, so what was it about boxing? Let me ask that differently. When you were young, did you love boxing more than other sports, or was it sort of equal with like Temple basketball and maybe the Eagles or whoever else you were watching?
Okay, first of all, let's get something straight about my amateur boxing career. It
Yeah.
consisted of one unofficial fight in a club where I learned how to box. So I don't want people, getting the wrong impression. Growing up in Philly in the 50s, the only sport that I even cared about or noticed was baseball. And it wasn't easy to follow the Phillies in the 50s because they were terrible. But once I fell in love with boxing, that was it. College basketball was a if boxing was one, college basketball was 1A for many years, but nothing. It was a distant 1A.
Gotcha. And were there, so just digging into that, were there any other sports that you were intrigued in at all, or was it really just those two that kept most of your attention?
No, I mean I started my first Eagles game was the opener of of '61, the year after they won the championship. I'd never been to a pro football game. Let's see, in '61, so I was 14, and the opening play of the first game I ever went to, Tim Brown of the Eagles got the ball 5 yards into the kickoff, 5 yards into the end zone, and ran 105 yards for a touchdown, the longest kickoff run in Eagles history. That was my introduction to pro football. And I started going to Warriors games with Wilt Chamberlain, but nothing really. I didn't know the history of those sports like I knew boxing because in 1959, right when I started watching fights, I went into the Doubleday bookstore in the Ballackinwood Shopping Center and bought in those days they called it a picture book. A what's it called today? I forget what the name is it for today. Nat Fleischer's Pictorial History of Boxing, and I devoured the book. And I read the book upside down, in and out, every picture, every caption. I thought I knew more about boxing than anybody who ever lived. And it just, like Dad would say, why don't you study chemistry like you studied the ring record book? But some things just stick in your head, and boxing stuck in my head.
Would you say, this is a weird question to ask, but say you were born in the year 2000 and, boxing came across your screen on ESPN or maybe your dad ordered one of the pay-per-views. Do you think you would have been as compelled now as you were in the 50s?
If I were 13, or 12? No, not at all. Not at all. It was, I'm a big fan of black and white photographs. And when I saw those black and white pictures on the cover of that book I bought, it just, it was an adult sport. It was your father's sport, but there was a rhyme and reason to boxing. Fights led to other fights. Guys moved up the ladder. Everybody fought everybody, and I thank my lucky stars that I lived through that. That I saw boxing and later became a part of it when it was real, when it meant something.
Now, do you feel that was a big part of the intrigue of boxing then? Sometimes I would say up to the 80s maybe, but the intrigue was the fact that you could watch a guy actually grow versus, not trying to insult anybody, but just taking fights to stay active.
Yeah, but you could still do that in the 80s. Actually, I think you could do that because you had all those great fights in the 80s in the casinos. I mean, the casinos were good for the promoters, bad for the future of the sport. And then in the 90s, we had that run at the Blue Horizon where we were like the small club Madison Square Garden, where in the old days people used to say, that you didn't make it till you fought in the garden. Well, that's the way it was in the 90s at the Blue Horizon. Fighters from all over the country wanted to fight there. So I think boxing changed. I always say that the first nail in the coffin was the demise of the USA Tuesday night fights in 1998, because it gave independent promoters a chance to build their fighters on television without having to turn them over to a promoter who controlled all the television like it is today. An independent promoter today cannot make it on his own. Just can't do it. So, but like you'd watch a kid like, let's say Benny Kid Paret. He comes from nowhere. He beats the number one guy, Charlie Scott, twice. He fights a draw with Federico Thompson, who had knocked out the champ in a non-title fight. He gets a title fight with Don Jordan. He wins it, and then he defends against Federico Thompson, the guy he'd fought the draw with. I mean, there was an order to things. Same thing with Dick Tiger. Comes up, beats Ace Armstrong, beats Henry Hank, beats Florentino Fernandez, beats Spider Webb, gets a title fight. That's the way it was. With one champ in each division, that's what you had to do. There was an order of things, and that is terribly missing today. It's chaos.
Let's we'll get into it actually. I wanted to take it back to your childhood, but
It's
I'm
okay.
so intrigued by all this, and I have 100 questions about it. So I guess we can dig in. So one thing in your book, and I could pull it up because actually I saved the page, but I'll try to paraphrase it. I noticed. I'll pull it because if I misquote you, that would just be wrong. So I
I
want to find.
remember.
Okay, so this is page 392 in the epilogue, and it's sort of like a letter that you write to boxing in total. Um, Goes, it's been difficult for me to adjust to the 21st century boxing. It's not only the multiple champions in multiple weight classes. Fighters lose titles by being overweight, pay minimal fines, and receive mild suspensions from toothless commissions. When I think of what Jake LaMotta had to do to get his 1949 shot at Marcel Cerdan's middleweight title, throw a fight to Billy Fox to satisfy the mob, and I see how nonchalantly today's fighters give up their titles on the scales, the lack of respect for the belt sickens me, however cheaply they come. So and I'm not trying to make this the aha moment or the big like gotcha, but I actually agree with a lot of that. But I wonder, from your perspective, who's to blame for boxing falling off to where it is right now, where fighters can't grow the way that they really need to? Because it sounds like the blame is on commissions, could be on the fighter, could be on the promoters. Like, where do you feel that lies?
The In no particular order, the sanctioning bodies. People say, why can't you make the fights you used to make, like Saad Muhammad against Marvin Johnson at the Spectrum? just for the North American title, because you can't make those fights today, because once a fighter gets into the top 10, his competitive fights are over because he's got four choices and he can just move up by attrition and get a title fight. When there was only one champ, you had to fight your way up the ladder most of the time to get a title shot. Number two, fighters come in overweight, they get suspended for 30 or 60 days. Who fights that often? It's not like in the old days, Harry Greb, okay, 45 fights in 1 year, but guys fighting 5, 6 times a year. Now they fight once or twice a year. So what is a 60-day suspension? And what is a 10% fine on a purse when you're making $3 million? You're paying 300,000, so you still got 2,700,000. I mean, it's terrible. But that's the business. That's the way it is today. And there are people in the business today, media people, who have no idea what it was like when it was real. Their knowledge of boxing probably goes back to maybe 1980. The only thing they might know before that is Muhammad Ali. And the media is terribly ignorant of anything below the big light fights. There was a show in Philly the other night in which Jesse Hart was fighting the main event. Okay? He was getting about 15 grand. In the middle of the show was canceled because the promoter had no money. He ran out of money. So how did this happen? How did the commission let this happen? How did he get a life? You haven't, from the look on your face, you haven't even read about this. Okay? These are things that people have to see. All they know is Teofimo Lopez or Canelo Alvarez or Usyk and Fury. They don't know about the guts of boxing, what goes on, the middle class, how promoters struggle. Oh, all promoters are making money. That's not true. You could read that in my book. There's not enough. You know who John Feinstein was, the sports writer who. Anyway, he used to be on ESPN's the Sunday morning sports reporters. He wrote about all different sports. I wish he had taken a trip around the country like I did in '76 looking for talent and going into all these small towns, Indianapolis, Orlando, Corpus Christi, New Orleans, San Bernardino, and see how boxing tries to survive in the outposts. Nobody writes about that today. Nobody. And it's when I got the job, I'm rambling now. When I got the job at ESPN in 1998, they hired me to decide what fights were going to be on the air. I thought it was the culmination of all these years making good fights. I'm finally being rewarded. I wanted to go to places like Steubenville, Ohio, or Des Moines, Iowa. I offered the promoters fights, but we agreed to pay them more if they did it in a live arena rather than in a casino. It's because I didn't want a fighter from Boston fighting a guy from Houston and putting it in some godforsaken casino in Spokane, Washington, where there's no atmosphere. But, my job at the top didn't last long. It was a palace coup, and I was just wound up being an errand boy for a few years. But there's no quality. I don't know. It's just there's no quality control. When you turn over ESPN to Bob Arum, and I love Bob Arum, okay, or DAZN to Eddie Hearn, you're giving them carte blanche. If I had a deal like Hearn or Arum do, where I'm getting $85 million a year from DAZN or ESPN, I don't care whether I control the fighters or not. I just want to make good fights. I mean, you got a 3-year deal. How much money do you need? People are going to die with millions in their bank accounts passed on to their kids, who will pass it on to their kids. Why not put the money back into the sport and just make the best fights? You go on BoxRec, right?
All the time, yeah.
BoxRec. The left-hand side, everybody's undefeated or has a glittering record. The right hand side, they have terror. I mean, can't the promoters even wake up to the fact maybe once in a while you want to switch it up? You know, we used to bet corners when we were kids. I'll take the red corner or whatever it was. I'll take the blue. You can't
No,
you
no.
don't lay a lot of odds, but
One
it's
corner is ranked 100 spots higher on box record or more. Even honestly, you notice it when you could look at even a top rank card, and obviously there's the televised ones, and then everything under. They might just be bringing them along, just like we're talking about. But you notice even on the televised ones, there's still a massive gap in BoxRec's not perfect, but their ranking system is somewhat, fair. And you look at the spots between guy A and guy B, and it's like 100 or more different. You rarely get them within like 30.
because promoters today are managers. There's no managers today. Managers, maybe, are financiers or babysitters. The promoters are really the managers, and it's all about getting the W and getting to a certain point. And the reason that works sometimes is because when a fighter has fought 25 so-called mediocre opponents in a row, and he gets a big fight, 9 times out of 10, the guy he's fighting came up the same way. So it's I've said this 100 times. You don't get the best fighters on television. You get the fighters with the best records. You know,
Absolutely.
could George Benton lost 13 fights out of like 75. Could he get on TV today with a record like that? Eddie Briscoe was 66-24. I'm not putting that guy on TV. Look how many times he's lost. It's sad. It's really because for someone who actually loves boxing, loved it. It was my whole life as a kid. I'd go to parties on Friday nights where everybody's upstairs dancing. We're playing the 45 RPM records. I'm downstairs in the basement watching Sugar Ray Robinson and Paul Pender. This is all I cared about.
Now, let me ask this then, because you were going around really digging for talent and fighters to bring onto your promotion. It seems like now it's changed a lot because the big promoters are almost a monopoly. And if someone has the national championship or, 3 or 4 of them, top rank can say, okay, they're really talented, come to the big leagues. And it's the big leagues to everyone that watches it because it's on TV. It's Bob Arum, the biggest promoter in boxing, yada, yada. Do you think that has a lot to do with it? Just the fact that smaller promoters can't even compete for their local guys over a top rank or matchroom?
Well, they can't because sooner or later the fighter wants to get on television, and that guy can't do it without turning over half his contract. You will rarely see fights, let's say a 6-round fight on a card, where one guy is like 6-5 and the other guy is 4-7. You never see that, even though it could be the greatest fight you ever saw. You don't see that's the promoter's job was to make the best fights to entice the fans to buy tickets. And if the fans, that's why we were so successful at the Blue Horizon in the 90s, because it didn't matter who fought. Everybody knew the fights were going to be competitive. So I didn't need ticket sellers because we were selling out. It didn't matter if I was fighting you in the main event. People were coming because they knew they were getting competitive fights. And I said and in the book, if you remember, Frank Gelb, who managed Saad Muhammad and Jimmy Young and Tyrone Everett, his son was at one of my fights in the 90s, and he turned to me and he said, Russell, you haven't cut a break for a single guy on the card. Every fight is a war. Down to the 4-rounders, and I turned to him, I said, Alan, look at the crowd. This is what they want. That was the job of a promoter. The manager's job was to maneuver his fighter with different promoters and try and get up the ladder. The promoter's job was to make the best fights, and the best fighters survived. So you've got real quality at the top. You don't have it. You don't listen. you, it's sad.
Something just popped up in my mind as you were saying that. You had made a remark, that same remark that promoters are the managers now, but you also said they promote fighters, not fights,
Right.
and it just made sense as you said it, because people know if they're coming to the Blue Horizon, they're just going to see a lot of really competitive, tough fights. But is that something that you had to establish where people knew if they came to one of your shows, there's going to be great fights? Because they don't know until they see it, right?
I think that a few years ago, Eric Botcher, who's a terrific matchmaker, he interviewed me for something that he's going to show a couple of years from now, and he said, "What would you like to be remembered as?" And I said, "For my reputation." But I was wrong because reputation is what other people think of you. I should have said my character, which is who I am. But by the time we got to the 90s, I'd already established a reputation of making good fights. And the Blue Horizon itself was very helpful, even though other promoters never had the success there that I did. You just, somebody asked me, they did a story on me in Boxing News years ago when I was overseas with Charles Brewer. They said, "What's the trick to being a good matchmaker?" And I said, "You have to want to make good fights. That's all. You want to make a good fight, you make a good fight. You want to get your guy a W, you put him in with a turkey." It's so simple. And I say to some of these new promoters, I say, just make good fights, because if you don't make it, nobody will be able to tell you that you put on lousy fights and that's why you failed.
Let me ask this one then, because does it make financial sense for everybody working in boxing to just put on great fights, more so than just building up a record?
Well, probably not anymore. Probably not anymore. Casinos, casinos want championship fights. TV wants championship fights. Not that anybody knows the difference between a world middleweight title fight, a world gold middleweight title fight, an interim fight. It's nobody knows the difference. I mean, the biggest fight of the year was Jake Paul and Mike Tyson. How sad is that? I was talking to David Feldman the other day. He runs the bare knuckle fighting, and he's moving into Philly in January. I said, "David, you know what? If boxing hadn't gone into the tank in the last 10 years, the UFC and bare knuckle would never be the juggernaut they are now, because people would still be into real boxing. But it's been so long since we had real boxing. It's, you know, people look at me, what's real boxing? When I was a kid, I could name all the lightweight champions backwards from Carlos Ortiz to Benny Leonard. Okay, you're talking 1962 to 1920s. I couldn't even tell you who the lightweight champion is today. And honest, I don't know. I don't care. I mean, it's just so fractured. My good friend Nigel Collins, his attitude is, former editor of The Ring and an outstanding Hall of Fame boxer, he enjoys the fights. He just concentrates on going to a fight and hoping he sees a good fight. I'm more interested in, how did this fight happen? How did it come together? Is it deserving of the place it is? I know it's the business side, but that was always, the build-up. Suppose, what season it just ended? The baseball season. I always use this as an example. Suppose there were no playoffs. At the end of the season, every division winner walks around, "I'm the champ. No, I'm the champ. No, I'm the champ."
And their fans just argue endlessly. They just argue endlessly on who's the best and why, with strange politics, right? Let's just flip it all over then. Let's say tomorrow there's a role created, boxing becomes a monopoly, you run the entire show. All shows have to go through you to be sanctioned, to be promoted, everything. What do you do differently, and how would it make boxing better? stronger, like financially stronger too, for that matter.
Eliminate all the sanctioning bodies. Just say if I'm controlling the money, I'm controlling the business. And you either fight or you don't fight. And you get paid what you're worth. Now, listen, I'm for fighters making as much money as they can. I know what it's like just to hold your hands up inside those gloves for 3 minutes. And when I see a guy in the audience saying, he's a bum, I said, what are you talking about? He's in the ring. Anybody who gets in the ring is not a bum. I don't care what his record is. So I say, this is the fight we're going to make. And like in the old days, you'll get a percentage of the money. You'll get a fair percentage of the money. Champs used to get 40%. Challengers used to get 20%. We even did that at the Blue Horizon for years. The lead guy would get, I remember my very first show, Benny Briscoe got a guarantee of $1,000 against 25% of the gate. Tito Marshall got 600 against, Benny got 15% of the gate. I don't think either of them ever figured they were going to get more. So Benny, instead of getting 1,000, wound up with like 1,500. And Tito Marshall, instead of getting 600, wound up with around 900. Okay? And they were honest figures. Okay? And I made like 1,400 on the show. Everybody was happy. Promoters don't always make money, and fighters certainly are not getting underpaid now, but the fighters that are making the majority of the money, like I say, 5% of the people are generating 95% of the income. They're overpaid based on viewership and attendance. If these guys had to survive on the gate and what people like Mort Sharnick at CBS back in the day, or Ferdy Pacheco at NBC, or Alex Wallow at ABC told you what the fight was worth and what you were going to pay, these guys would starve or they wouldn't fight. They'd be fighting but give me listen, I was talking to Tom Brown today because I got a whole new view on Al Heyman today. Not that I've been a big fan of Al Heyman, but I understand that he's done some really nice things for some fighters who needed help. But anyway, if somebody had given me $600 million, the fights I could have made, the first thing I would have done was I would have bought the Blue Horizon and put it back on the map. What would it cost me? $7-8 million to get it together? I'm still left with 594 million, to make fights. Nobody. It's a shame. It's a shame. I hate to be negative, but
No, it's okay.
When you love something, and it's been your whole life, and you were fortunate that you fell in love with something when you were 12, and you turned it into your vocation. I mean, there's wonderful times, wonderful years. I remember the first time my dad took me to Madison Square Garden in 1963 to see Emil Griffith fight Louis Rodriguez. It was the first fight I went to. Am I okay talking?
Yeah, I'm loving it. Yeah, it's all you.
I was the week of my 14th birthday, December 6, 1960, and I grew up on Philly's main line, which was all white. I never went to school with any black kids until I was in 10th grade. And the only black people I knew were the women who came to clean our house. Or my dad was a plumber and two of the men who worked for him were black. And I walked into Convention Hall that night. There was about 5,000 or 6,000 people that night. And at least half of them were black. And this was a whole new world for me. And I said, wow, look at this. This is so cool. I guess I was in a hurry to grow up, and I'm standing next to a guy, and I'm a white guy, a light-skinned guy, and I'm about to say something to him, and he turns to his buddy and says, "Como está usted?" I said, holy shit, this guy's Spanish. I mean, it was like I had an epiphany that night when I looked at the ring and I saw the smoke, over, the mushroom cloud over the ring, which you had in those days because you could smoke. I said, this is going to be a part of my life somehow, some way. And I guess I wanted to grow up fast and be an adult because it was your dad's sport. Not that my dad was a big fan, but if any sport he liked, it was boxing, and it was a grown-up sport.
That's actually a great segue because a question I wanted to ask you. It's a weird one to ask. I'm going to try my best though. So, you know, MMA obviously this probably has been asked of you like 1,000 times, right? Like, what's the comparison between that and the success it's having in boxing? But I actually want to give an observation I've made myself. I've thought about this over and over, and I think that boxing is a sport that people grow into. Maybe as you get older, you can appreciate the nuances of it and the rhythm of it. And it's a lot like, to me, it's like a good cigar. A good boxing match is like a good cigar. You appreciate all these small nuances. And MMA, and I don't mean this as an insult, but it's like a cigarette. You take it and you get a buzz from it. You go, wow, that was great, but you're not appreciating all of these nuances and the different flavors of it and all of these things. And I think that because they always say, well, the young people aren't getting into boxing, and I a lot of times think it's not really for young people. Sometimes it is, like Canelo and stuff, but to really appreciate it, you sort of have to have a patience for it. That's my observation of it, and I would love to hear your perspective on comparing the two.
I Even if I come across an MMA match or a UFC match, first of all, I can't tolerate a guy laying on the floor and a guy sitting over and punching him in the face. I don't care. I can't get into that. It just didn't seem. It almost seemed like cheating when you could use your feet. I just was so ingrained in like boxing that nothing came close. People used to say, well, why don't you get into wrestling? That makes more money. I said, I don't like wrestling. I like boxing. In other words, I never even thought about money. My dad, first of all, when I was going to be a sports writer, he laid in my bed one night and said, what do you want to do that for? You can't make any money, you know. And then when I told him I was going to be a boxing promoter, he said, why don't you just be a boxing promoter on the side and get a real job? I never knew how much money my dad made when I was growing up. Kids weren't into that. Today, my son knows everything about how much I make, what this costs. You just wanted to do something that you loved. And I loved boxing, and I never even thought. I knew I could always go back to the newspaper business if boxing. In fact, my sports editor told me, if it doesn't work, you'll come back. They didn't think it would work, but it's not just the fights, as I said before. It's what makes the fights, how the fights develop, because this guy beat this guy. And, Teddy Brenner at the Garden used to say, fights make fights. A beats B, C beats D, so A should fight C. That's what it was like. That's so far off what's going today. It's not even in the same universe. And then a guy says, like Canelo says, let's say he fights in September. Well, I'm going to fight again on Mexican Independence Day, which is May. They make a big deal out of fights today. We made these fights back then like it was breaking sticks. Oh, this is the greatest fight. Ennis is going to fight Virgil Ortiz. Now, I know it fell apart, but this was not a big deal. You fought him. That's all. And you fought him for the amount of money that was available. And the promoter did okay. The fighters did okay. And people came out to watch the fights.
Do you feel, well, you probably know for a fact, and I won't name any specific promoters, but is it possible to make money promoting these guys with these massive guarantees? Like, I just feel like the promoters are shooting themselves in the foot. I'm maybe ignorant about this, but Canelo won't fight for less than 50 million, and some of the guys he's fighting, it's like, I don't know if they can draw what they need to. I mean, is that gonna hurt them? Like it has to, right?
Well, anything that goes to Saudi Arabia is making money because they're footing the bill. I mean, it's sad that we have to depend on Saudi Arabia, not exactly a utopia for people, certainly not for women, certainly not for Jewish people. But it's sad that boxing has to depend on that for the mega fights. Now, if Canelo seems to draw big money, but listen, if you got 85 million a year from ESPN, okay? So we're going to make this fight. We're going to take 3 million out of the 85 million to cover this fight. The next month we'll take 8 million out. So you're it's enough to make money on. And then listen, Top Rank has big time expenses with those shows. It costs them close to $500,000 every show before they even pay a fighter. That's for the travel for all their staff, the hotel rooms, the lights, the rigging, everything that goes into the operating expenses of a show. $500,000. Okay? Then they got to pay the fighters on top of that. So, it's not as easy as it seems, but and then you got Eddie Hearn, who does very well in England because they still have hero worship over there. England was always big, always big. A lot of the other countries that used to be big, like France and Italy, have died down. I mean, we used to go to France so often I got tired of going, you know. But who knows? The Top Rank contract is up in August, and we'll see what happens then. There's always rumors that Dana White's going to come in and use his leverage with the UFC to take over boxing. Who knows? I don't see their books. I don't know. Aram has an incredible film library, which you can see on Tubi TV, all the great fights he's promoted. He's got an incredible staff, the best staff in boxing, in my opinion. Bruce Trampler and Brad Goodman. No, listen, I love Eric Gomez at Golden Boy, and nobody has the boxing knowledge that those two guys have. And then you got Brad Jacobs, who used to be with USA and helped me tremendously at the Blue Horizon. He's the coordinator. He picks out the sites. There's not another company in boxing, apologies to Tom Brown with Al Heyman, that can match those guys and their track record. To me, they're still the number one promotional company in boxing. And but I've known Aram since 1974, and I've known Bruce since 1971, so maybe I'm a little bit prejudiced. I like them all. I do business with all of them, or I have done business with all of them. But, see, I wrote the book because I would read things on social media that were just outrageous. Just, the most ridiculous one that people said, the most obvious one, that Hagler got robbed twice in Philly, once with Boogaloo Watts and once with Willie the Worm Monroe. Well, he didn't. Willie the Monroe kicked his butt that night. There's no film because of the snowstorm, but I was there, and Hagler admitted so in the papers the next day. So that's just one example. People who weren't even around back then, but talk like they were, and some of the outrageous things they say. So that's why I wrote the book. I made $133.78 on my second show. We charged $4 for ringside and $2 for the balcony. So I had to argue with guys for $50 purses for 4 rounds. That's what we could afford. That's another thing that nobody writes about. It's only the Garden. It's only Vegas. It's only the Staples Center. It's only Wembley. There's so many great stories in boxing that today's writers ignore. No, just more so than in any other sport, because like Seth Abraham said years ago, in boxing, everybody flies the Jolly Roger. There's no organization. Stuff goes on that makes such great stories and nobody writes about it. I don't know if I answered your question, but
No, that's good. I want to get to that, like the Spectrum, the Blue Horizon. These were special venues. The Blue Horizon looks like it was made for boxing specifically. So I'm assuming it was. I know you wrote it in the book. I can't remember. I'm assuming it was for plays at one point in time.
no, it was a lodge for Mason's Moose Hall. They had an auditorium there. No, it was built like in the turn of the century, maybe in the 20s. They had two fights there in the 30s, and not another fight again there till early 60. It was for meetings and clubs and things like that. Um,
Why? So why not? Why hasn't anyone ever capitalized on the idea of building a venue similar to it, where it's or converting a venue similar to it, where you can create that intimate space where everybody's together and right over the ring? Like that seemed like a brilliant concept.
well, the people who took it over now are trying to sell it for 7.5 million. I think they bought it for 3 or 4 million. They realized they were going to turn it into a boutique hotel, and suddenly, it's hard to believe, realized there was no area for a parking lot. And that, I understand, is the reason they had given up on the boutique hotel. I was by the Blue Horizon about a month or two ago, and they still have scaffolding them up and chicken wire around it, but nothing's happening. They shut it down in 2010. That's 14 years ago. Nothing's happening. No, people, nobody, you, nobody cares to build a venue like that. Everybody runs to casinos. We were all guilty of it at one time, and casinos are great in the short run because the 1980s in Atlantic City was a license to print money. Okay, it was financially it was wonderful, but then you figure that a kid 16 and 8, I don't know if it's 16 or 18 and under, can't go in. So where's the future? How do you build the future with the young kids when they can't go in? The first time we went to the Sands Casino in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, it's now called the Wind Creek. In 2012, we had to do it outdoors in a tent, but you had to walk through the casino to get to the tent. So there were even some fighters or wannabe fighters who were, no, 21, I think it was 21. They couldn't go to the fight. And
That's
people don't
crazy.
realize that. There used to be a sign up at the Garden in New York that anyone 16 or younger couldn't go in unless accompanied by an adult to a fight. So that's why you can't build up, as I said earlier, you can't have a guy from Boston fighting a guy from Miami Beach and put the fight in some casino in Indiana. But it's so easy for promoters to do that. They don't have to rent an arena. They get free hotel rooms. They get meals. The tickets are printed. The security, everything.
It's
All
all
you have
built
to
in.
do is pay the fighters. So it's easy.
It's a draw to sell tickets too, because you can get a lot of crossover. There might be people who love boxing. There might also be people who are interested in seeing a match, but also to go to the slots or blackjack afterwards. Now it's a whole experience. I mean, I've seen it happen.
Well, like when we were in Atlantic City in the 80s, we used fighters from Philly. Frank the Animal Fletcher, Jeff Chandler, Gary Hinton, Robert Hines, guys like that. So we always had a big atmosphere, a big crowd. But you can't develop look at what Vinny Pazienza did in Providence, Rhode Island, or Cranston, Rhode Island, or what Ray Mancini did in Youngstown. You can't build fighters like that in casinos in the middle of nowhere. You get which was nice that Top Rank just went to Norfolk with Keyshawn Davis, and they
Yeah.
sold out 8,000 people. Now, whether that was financially viable for them or not, I don't know. Maybe Davis had it in his contract that he had to have at least one fight in his backyard. Or Jared Anderson fought somewhere in Ohio last year and they packed the place. There's not enough of that. Not enough of that.
What about a concept of, nowadays a smaller promoter, and you wrote this in the book and it's so true. There are some guys that are promoters, but they're not promoting fights. They have promoter contracts with fighters that they can sell to a bigger promoter or make a new contract where essentially someone signed to, Top Rank or whoever, and, they get a percentage of it out of that. But what if it went backwards or it went down? So, for example, if I'm a major promoter and I want to hold all of these guys and I have to build them up too, I don't really feel like a guy can be built up fighting on the undercard of a televised fight. I don't think he can be built up just being on TV. I think he has to be built up in his hometown. Why not have a promoter from his hometown run something similar to like a minor league program? All the fighters from Chicago have to fight each other in Chicago, Wisconsin, Indiana. The best of them will then come up to fight at a higher level, and you build them up that way.
Well, you're talking about changing the whole concept of the business. Listen, promoters, let's just take the last kid I had that won a world title, Jason Sosa. He had like 3 amateur fights. And he fought for me a couple times, maybe he had a half a dozen, 8 fights. And I wanted to sign a kid who was from the same stable named Anthony Bergen, who looked like he was going to go somewhere. And the trainer said, you can sign Bergen, but you have to take Sosa. I said, I don't want Sosa. He said, well, then you can't have Bergen. So I signed Sosa, okay? And Sosa all of a sudden scored like 12 or 15 knockouts in a row. Okay? So the guy I didn't want. But there were shows with Sosa where we lost serious money. I mean, you could go into what's now known as the 2300 Arena in South Philly and you could lose $28,000 on a given night. And people say, oh, you're full of shit. Why would you do that? You do that to keep the fighter busy. I mean, that's a little bit of that's a lot of money to lose, okay? I don't care how much money you have, okay? But the only way to get Sosa on television was to give up half his go partners with Top Rank, okay? So when that happens, my contract says, let's say there's $100,000 on the table for Sosa to fight Nicholas Walters on HBO. Okay, this is December of 15. Yeah, up at the Turning Stone Casino. There's $100,000 on the table. I took 20% off the top. Sosa's purse became $80,000. Okay, that's what his manager got his percentage from. His trainer got his. Because I've invested in Sosa for 3 or 4 years. Listen, I could tell you horror stories about promoters who took 50%.
Absolutely.
Okay? Or more. Okay? Or booking agents who happen to find a fighter that they've never done anything for and put him in a big fight and make more money than the fighter. And that's why commissions have to crack down on that. They don't crack down on booking agents. They don't crack down on promoters. But anyway, so I was entitled to 20% because it still didn't cover the 28 grand we lost that one night. Okay? And then if I tell the story, Top Rank was upset because they had Nicholas Walters also, and it was a draw. And I love Sosa, but he did not fight a draw that night. Nicholas Walters beat him. I don't know what happened. I never bought a judge in my life, never paid off a single official in my life. I was as shocked as everybody else was who saw it on TV. Top Rank was upset. We couldn't, all of a sudden they had nothing for us. I couldn't put him back in the 2300 arena and pay him 7500. He just made 80,000. I got a call from Samson Lukowitz, who had
David
Javier,
Benavides?
no, Fondor, wait, who did we beat for the title? I'm losing it. Anyway, Javier, who did Sosa beat for the title? This is terrible. Anyway, I'll have to look it up while I'm talking to you.
I should keep BoxRec on the screen too. That way I could just be, you know what I mean, spot checking it as we go.
He had a fight for us in Beijing for the title. Okay? It was less money than we got to fight Walters. Fortuna. Javier Fortuna, left-hander. But Chino Rivas, Sosa's trainer, said, we can beat this guy. Nobody else thought we could. So we went over there, and I remember, I'll never forget it because Sosa's losing the whole way, gets knocked down early. And I was with my wife, Linda, and around the, boy, am I off track here, but around the 8th or ninth round, I said, Linda, Fortuna's getting braver. He's getting closer. He thinks he can knock Sosa out. Once he gets close enough, Sosa can hit him. And in the 10th round, because Fortuna thought he had the fight wrapped up, he did on points. He got close enough, and Sosa dropped him twice and then stopped him in the next round. And it was, you know, at that point in my career, to have a win like that on the road was like Indian Summer, which is the title of that chapter in the book. And I remember going back to the hotel after the fight. It was literally across the street from the arena. And everybody went upstairs to call home because, you know, it was like 5 in the morning in Philadelphia, 6 in the morning. And I went to a bar. I was the only guy at the bar in the hotel, one of these real dark neon lit bars. I was the only guy at the bar. And I had said to myself, you know, all those great nights, did I appreciate them as much as I should have? You know, because life goes so fast. And I sat at that bar with a beer, and I said, I'm just going to sip this beer and just suck it all in. It was just a great night. So anyway, Samson gets us, Top Rank still had nothing. So Samson gets us a fight in Monte Carlo. He had 3 options on Sosa. Gets us a fight in Monte Carlo with Steve Smith. I think there was 125,000 on the table. I don't know. Sosa got 100. I got 25. That's maybe I forget the numbers. Maybe Sosa got 125. I can't remember. And Sosa won. Now Top Rank had a fight for us. Lomachenko. Okay. So this is, I told this story at the Atlantic City Boxing Hall of Fame. We agreed on a price. I said, what about Samson? And they said, did he send you a letter? Because Samson's contract said he had to notify us in writing after each fight within 30 days that he was picking up the option for the next fight. I said, no, he didn't send me a letter. They said, well, he's out. I said, no, he's not out. I talked to this guy every day on the phone. You had nothing for us. Now we're world champ and you're going to kick out the guy who got us there? Well, they threatened to sue me, everything. And I said, we're not fighting. And finally they came around. They gave Samson some money. I gave Samson some money out of my end. But and he lost to Lomachenko, but he got the biggest payday of his career. See, this story goes back to 1980 when I had Jeff Chandler. And Jeff Chandler was undefeated. He had just got into the top 10 bantamweights. And we got a call from Muhammad Ali Professional Sports, MAPS, who they were throwing around money like it was water. This was before they got caught.
That was a big scam, wasn't it?
Yeah. So they offered us a fight with Julian Solis in Miami, who was undefeated for the title. Sure, we'll take it. We go down to Miami. We knock Solis out in the 14th round. MAPS had a contract on Chandler saying they had the rights to his first 3 title defenses. I was a minority partner as long as they notified us in writing within 30 days. So me being me, I'm counting the days. 15, 20, 25, 30. Now remember, I'm 1980, I'm 33. 30 days came and went. I called up Chandler's managers, Willie O'Neill and K.O. Becky. I said, we're free. They never sent us the letter. We can do whatever we want. So Willie O'Neill, who had done time in prison for murder and was the James Cagney of his generation, said, what are you, crazy? He said, why would you want to fuck the very people that got us a title fight when we couldn't do it on our own? He said, we don't do business like that. And I said, you're right. You're right.
Wow.
And so 37 years later, it came in handy. I never forgot what he said. It came in handy with the Lomachenko thing when I said, you're not going to screw Samson. He got us the title fight. So these are things you learn in boxing because you got to do the right thing. I didn't always do the right thing. There's things in that book. I was giving a speech the other night. I talked about Tommy Hearns when he came to Philly. I don't know if you remember that part of the book. He had knocked out all 17 guys, 16 of them in Michigan. He came to the Spectrum. He was fighting the semifinal to Bobby Chacon against Jerome Artis. He was getting $5,000. So 2 weeks before the fight, Chacon pulled out and so did Artis. So we moved Hearns up to the main event. And he came in early and he was training at Joe Frazier's gym. And I walked in there one day and Emmanuel Stewart says, have you heard from my lawyer? I said, no. He said, well, you're going to get a call. So I go back to the Spectrum to my office and his lawyer calls me. He says, we want more money. I said, what are you talking about? He said, we're the main event now. I said, you're fighting Alfonso Heyman. You know, come on. You know, we're going to lose money on the card. So he said, we're going to leave town if you don't pay us more money. So I agreed to give him an extra $1,000, $6,000, and a percentage of the gate. Okay. So came the night of the fight. I told the Spectrum people, just to cover myself, I said, he never signed a new contract. I'm not paying him the extra money. And I need security. I need security in the payroll room when they come in. And Hearns went the limit for the first time. He hurt his hand because I didn't give him the right gloves, which was in the contract. I didn't pay the walkout music. So Emmanuel Stewart came in and he said, where's the extra money? I said, you never signed a contract. You're not getting it. He went to the commissioner and showed him the original contract where it said we had to use a certain brand of gloves and we had to play a certain song. And the commissioner said, Emmanuel, you're showing me the original contract, and the original contract says 5,000, not 6. And that's the one I'm going to back. Now, it was a terrible thing that I did. It was terrible. I told the man I was going to pay him 6,000, and I should have done it because I value my word. And I was wrong. I was pissed off. I was 31, 32 years old. I was immature, even after almost 10 years in business. It was the wrong thing to do. And I was ashamed of it, you know, as the years went on, even though we made peace. And if you got that far in the book, when I was writing the book, I got an attack of guilt. So I called Jackie Callan, and she put Hearns on the phone. I said, remember that 1,000? Yeah, oh, yeah, I remember. I said, well, I'm sending it to you. Give me your address. I'm sending you $1,000. So Tommy says, you know, Russell, $1,000 is worth a lot more today than it was worth in 1979.
I was about to say that. What's the interest on, you know, like, what's the time value of that?
But I said, guess what? You don't have to pay your manager. You don't have to pay your trainer. You don't have to pay any expenses. I said, take the 1,000. And you know, so that's why, you know, like I said in the book, I wrote the good, bad, and the ugly of boxing. And none of us are perfect. I like to say only Rocky Marciano was perfect. That's all.
So the longer you stayed in boxing, the more ethical you became.
Yeah, well, you know, you learn a lot of lessons. Like the one, you read about Joe Granby the greatest, probably the greatest, the guy that'll never get into the Hall of Fame, but his career is so far better than a lot of the guys in there. Managed Bob Montgomery in the 40s, Charlie Scott, Tex Cobb, Tony Thornton. He had George Benton fought for me. The first show in 1970, I just turned 23. The fight's over. Can we get another date, Russell? Yeah. March. Your fight come back in March. I go home. I start thinking, wait a second. I made 300 on the show, which was cool, but I paid Benton 1,000. I paid his opponent 600 hotel. I could buy a whole main event for less than 1,000 and still make money. I said, but I told Granby I was going to do it. And Granby was an intimidating figure, and I'm a kid. And I go to them promoting every 2 weeks. I go to the gym, and for a month and a half, Benton's not in the gym. I'm saying, oh boy, maybe he got sick, maybe he got hurt, maybe Granby took another fight. And then we're late February already, going into March. The show's scheduled for March 25th. One night Benton comes up the steps into the gym. I said, what are you doing here? He said, I thought I was fighting for you in a few weeks. I said, well, I hadn't seen you, George, so I was making other plans. So he goes to the payphone, calls Granby, gives me the phone. Granby says, hey, Russell. No, he called me promoter. Never called me Russell. Promoter, entrepreneur, impresario. He says, I hear we may not be fighting for you on March 25th. I said, Joe, well, we never signed the contract. And he said, what's the matter? Isn't your word any good? Oh, he made me feel like Tiny Tim.
Sounds like they know your buttons, or they knew your buttons.
So I went through with the fight. But the story is 12 years later, when I'm working with Dan Duva on a new series, and we opened up in Atlantic City, a new cable series, he needed a big name for the opener. He said, can you get Tex Cobb? I said, yeah, I can get Tex Cobb. Joe Granby managed Tex Cobb. By this time, Granby and I are close. I pick him up on a Sunday morning. We go out to breakfast. All the papers are signed. We have a good time. I drop him off at his house. I drove home. About 20 minutes later, I get in the house. Linda says, Joe Granby called. I said, oh, Jesus, what's wrong? Because I'm the eternal pessimist. So I got one of those wall phones in the old kitchens where it's up against the wall. I said, hi, Joe, what's up? Guess who called me? I have no clue. Don King. I said, oh, Jesus, this can't be good.
Yeah.
I said, what do you think he wanted? I said, I have no idea. He said he just offered me $500,000 for Tex Cobb to fight Larry Holmes in April, same date as our show. Well, I'm sliding down the wall. I'm sick because contract or no contract, you can't hold a guy. You can't do that to a guy who's going to make $500,000. He says, what do you think I said to him? I'm in a fetal position by now on the floor. Because we needed Tex Cobb, and I told Dan Duva I could deliver it. He said, what do you think I said to him? I said, I have no idea, Joe. He said, I can't do it, Don, because I signed contracts with Russell, and even though they haven't been filed, I gave him my word. So I said, what'd Don say? He said, you don't want to know. But it came around. He made me keep my word, and he kept his word 12 years later. So these are things that you learn in any business. I learned these in boxing.
Do you think that maintaining that brand of honesty and integrity was one of the more valuable things about working with you that kept you around for so long?
Yeah, and I think that's why the mob, or shady, not so much the mob, although Blinky Palermo was around, that creep. People didn't approach me because they were afraid not that I'd say no, they were afraid that I'd rat on them. If they wanted me to do something unethical. Listen, I'm not perfect, okay? But other than asking George Benton once and Willie the Worm once to carry a guy, which neither of them did,
Yeah.
I never fixed a fight. I never bought a ranking. I never bought a full page ad in a convention program for five, you know, one of the sanctioning body programs, and I was never approached. Yeah, and I think people knew. Those who fought for me knew that if the contract said 1,500, you were getting 1,500. You weren't getting any more, and you weren't getting any less. But you always got what you. No matter how much money we lost, you were always getting paid.
And here's one, actually, I meant to ask it earlier when we were talking about it, but Saudi Arabia, obviously, as a boxing fan, it's nice to see. One of the things that everyone says is you want to see the best fight the best, and when they don't, it's a very bad thing for boxing. And we're starting to see it. Like, you know, you are starting to see the number one and number two guy fight. We got Usyk versus Joshua, Usyk versus Fury, and Betterby versus Bivol. So that's really cool. But you made a remark earlier that you said no one has to worry about money because they're paying for it. Turkey, I'm going to say his name wrong. It's Turkey Al-Sheikh, I think.
You got me.
But he's not making money then, is he? This is just him paying for fun. Am I crazy?
No, he's pay. No. From what I understand, the attendance at these fights is abysmal. Actual people in the stands. I know a lot of people that go over there, but they're not buying tickets. You know, they're not even paying to go over there. They're getting treated. What happens if the Turk says, I'm out? But it's not just that. That's such a small part of the business. There's fight cards going all over the place that are either drowning in red ink or are being financed by the managers of the fighters. I get calls. I manage or I advise about 6 guys. So one of the guys I advise is Bryce Mills, a junior welterweight from outside Syracuse. Before I came along, he was fighting. Now he's from Syracuse. He was fighting in the South, in South Carolina, Miami. He was buying the fights. He was paying himself and the other guy, and that's an extreme situation. Listen. You want to get? I could get this kid Carlos Marrero called me. He's from Bridgeport, Connecticut. He's 8 wins, 9 losses, 3 draws. But he's won 4 of his last 5 with me. So a promoter called him from Massachusetts and said, we can use you on our next card, but you got to pay for the fight. I said, we don't buy fights. We'll sit 6, 8, 10 months until we get the right fight. I mean, I could put Carlos Marrero in I get calls all the time, but he's fighting a guy who's 14-0, 18-1. He's not interested. So I know a lot of these fights cards are financed by the managers of the fighters. So let's say you got a kid and you want to get him a win. So you pay let's say it's a 4-round fight. You pay your kid $2,000, pay the other kid $2,000. Most of the time the other kid's from out of town. You pay his hotel, his travel, his medicals, your kid's medicals, and then you pay the promoter a fee for the right to do that. Okay? So now you're in the whole $5,000. Okay? You've just lost $5,000. Now what are you going to do? You're going to buy another fight. Okay?
Yep.
And then you're going to buy another fight. How deep in the hole, how many Boots Ennises are there? Which is how he started. That's 1 in a million. Let's say it's 1 in 100. You know the money that these guys are pissing away doing that? So these guys call themselves promoters. They're not promoters. They're distributors. They're facilitators. They're a conduit for these Who ever heard of that? Can you imagine me telling Benny Briscoe, I can't use you unless you sell 500 tickets or 200 tickets. I'm not going to put you on the show. The business is so upside down now. It's just, it's incredible. It's sad. It's sad. It really is. But that's, that guy's walking around, I'm 18-0. And then you look at the records of their opponents, and you add them up, and it's sad. It's sad. I had a 2-1 kid. A guy calls me. A kid moved into New York from Ecuador a month ago. He's 2-1. The two guys he beat never had a win, and the one guy he lost to was 1-1. There were three guys in Philly. They were all three. Two of them were 3-0, and one of them was 6-3, and they all refused to fight him. They all refused. I can't. That's why I couldn't promote anymore. I don't have the patience to deal with these people. Teddy Brenner used to say, he said, Russell, there's only two kinds of fighters: those that can fight and those that can't. So you put the two guys who can't in against each other. Why not? It's an even match. You let them fight each other. You let them you let them succeed on their own stage. You let it happen.
I agree. And at that point, you're giving them an opportunity to actually grow. They're being matched correctly. They can grow. The guy who wins at least can build off of that versus you're not going to get anywhere fighting guys who are driving 20 hours throughout the night, no sleep. They walk in, they're wearing running shoes in the ring, and you knock them out in one round. You jump up on the ropes. I guess I have this weird thing, and it keeps coming back, and I'm sure you're starting to notice it by now. My dreadful thought is that boxing itself doesn't seem to be sustainable right now. If you're a manager and you have to pay all this money to get your guys on just so a promoter can break even and do 2 to 3 shows, a local promoter, small promoter in Indiana or Wisconsin or wherever, it's not a money-making venture. And then even then, once you get to the top, you have to go to have a guy spend fun money in Saudi Arabia to sustain it there. And then no one's actually making money. The guy's losing money to do it. So it's, like you said, if he pulls out, that's gone. It's over with. So my anxiety, it's really not my cross to bear, but I always am anxious about this, that boxing isn't sustainable right now.
I think it'll always be around. Angelo Dundee had a great line years ago. He said, they've buried boxing so many times they've run out of shovels. Or the other one I heard, I don't know, boxing is like the cockroach of sports. You keep stomping on it, it keeps getting up. And it'll probably always be around, but I don't think it's ever going to be what it was when I was a kid, or even up through the 90s. I think it's opened the door for MMA to get bigger, certainly UFC, now bare knuckle boxing. When I speak, I remind people that from the beginning of time until 1958, it was baseball, boxing, and horse racing, professional sports, and not that's alphabetical order. I used 1958 as the dividing line because that was the year of the Colts-Giants NFL sudden death game, which jump-started pro football. And then you had Bird and Magic Johnson made the NBA. Let's see, 20 years later, 20 years, and ice hockey, and boxing stood still. Why didn't boxing stay with the times? Why, other sports are building multi-million-dollar arenas, and boxing's still looking for National Guard armories and catering halls. It's just, so we've got a whole new generation of fight fans that, listen, how can a guy who's in the top 10 right now, let's say a guy's in the top 10, he's 15-1, okay? How does he compare to a fighter from the 60s who was in the top 10 and his record was like 42-11-3? The experience, there's nothing like experience. Like, are you smarter now than you were 10 years ago? Sure. And the fighters were better because they were more experienced. Could Lennox Lewis beat Jack Johnson? Of course he could. If he's fighting him in 2005, of course he could. Okay? But if he's fighting him in 1910, he's going to get his ass kicked. And I'll tell you why. I told this story the other night. The first black heavyweight champion, he's fighting the former undefeated white heavyweight champion Jim Jeffries in Reno, right? Now I got to get this story right because I don't want to wind up like Jimmy the Greek. there was a popular song of the day, and you can look this up on Google. It was called "All Coons Look Alike to Me." Look it up. They played it all week long in Reno, and they played it when Johnson came out walking to the ring in front of 15,000 white people. Now, you're going to tell me that today's black athletes could handle that? There's no way. And how do you get to Reno? You're not flying to Reno, you're taking a train.
Yep.
And you're not going to be on a treadmill, you're going to be out in the forest chopping wood to train. And more than likely, you're not going to be 6'7" in 1910. See, to me, pound for pound means if everybody's the same size. If Rocky Marciano is the same size as Lennox Lewis, who wins the fight? I'm not into those comparisons, but
Yeah, I see what you mean, though. And that's where heavyweight's kind of a strange one, too, because they didn't make them like that before.
no, but
You could split that up into several more weight classes between what Tyson Fury is and even like what Mike Tyson was, at
Right.
210 pounds.
But training is different, eating is different, travel is different. Could Babe Ruth hit Bob Gibson? You think Babe Ruth could hit a Bob Gibson fastball? I don't know. But I think comparisons in any sport are ridiculous. Yeah, there's freaks of nature like Wilt Chamberlain who could probably survive anywhere. But, appreciate guys for what, I always see the Marvin, who would win, Hagler or Monzon? Leave it alone. They were two great champs. You'll see 100 replies on Facebook. Okay? I dealt with both of them. They were great fighters. Leave it go. Who cares? Who knows? Nobody wins that argument.
I do get tired of the fantasy matchups of like, if this person fought this person, and there's always one, well, not one, there's always a lot of people on both sides who, no matter who you say will win, they think you're an idiot. If you say, hey, Triple G, I think he'd do pretty well against Marvin Hagler. Are you stupid? Do you know what it was like in the 80s? You'll never, da, 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 da. And then there are people on the other side, like you're saying, like, oh, well, competition's so much stiffer now, it's not the same. It's like, you have no idea. You have no idea. It's so different. You can only compare them against their contemporaries that they actually fought. It's the only way.
It is what it is.
Well, Russell, this is actually my longest one. I typically do these for an hour. I know it's getting pretty late by you, but again, I'm so grateful. And the truth is I could probably ask 100 more questions, but maybe we could do this again another time.
No problem.
Awesome.
Enjoy it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.